China is a vast country with some 1.4 billion people. Although India is projected to surpass it as the world's most populous country this year, 2023, it is by no means a small country. While it is commonly accepted that there are many languages spoken in India, in contrast, the Chinese language is widely regarded as the sole language of China. From the outside world looking in, the Chinese people speak only one language and it's called Chinese. But what about Cantonese, Hokkien, Shanghainese and so on? Oh, those are dialects. That is the unfortunate line of thinking and the reason I created this video. Through this video, I want to explain the great diversity that is the Chinese language, or to be exact, Chinese languages, and to tell you that some of the things you thought you know about Chinese is wrong. The Chinese language. It is often regarded as the most widely spoken native language or first language among all the languages in the world. But what is the Chinese language? When most people say Chinese language, they often mean modern standard Mandarin. What a lot of people outside the Chinese-speaking world are not aware of is that modern standard Mandarin is not the only Chinese language. There is also Cantonese, Hokkien and Shanghainese, just to name three. But aren't these Chinese dialects? Well, yes and no. This boils down to the definition we give to the word dialect. The word dialect comes from the ancient Greek word dialektos, which means discourse. It can be used to refer to two distinctly different types of linguistic relationships. The more common definition refers to varieties of a particular language that are closely related and despite their differences are largely mutually intelligible. By that definition, if you speak one of the dialects of a language, you may sound different to the speaker of another dialect of that same language, even though to a great extent you understand each other. Used in such a way, Penang Hokkien and Singapore Hokkien are dialects of the Hokkien language. That's because while there are differences between the two, speakers of Penang Hokkien generally can understand speakers of Singapore Hokkien. But that's not the only definition of the word dialect. There is another less commonly understood definition, and that's where a fair bit of disagreements arise. The word dialect can also be used to define non-national languages of a country in reference to the country's official language. By this definition, these dialects are not actual dialects in the same sense as in the first definition, as they do not derive from one dominant language and are therefore not one of its varieties. This second definition of dialect is the one applied to the non-national languages of a country, such as Cantonese, Hokkien and Shanghainese, in relation to its official language, modern standard Mandarin. While Cantonese, Hokkien and Shanghainese may be historically cognate with and share genetic roots as the dominant national language, and even to a varying degree share some mutual intelligibility with Mandarin, they are better defined as separate languages from the standard or national language. Under this definition, Mandarin would not itself be considered a dialect, as it holds a dominant position in terms of linguistic prestige. This second definition is where the word dialect is used when referring to Cantonese, Hokkien and Shanghainese in relation to Mandarin. When Singapore's founding father, the late Lee Kuan Yew, referred to Hokkien, Teochew and Cantonese as dialects, he too was using this second definition. It does not mean that Cantonese, Hokkien and Shanghainese are varieties of Mandarin. What it does mean is that Mandarin has official status, the rest do not. So, when we hear the word dialect applied to any of the Chinese languages, we need to be clear whether the first or second definition is being used. More often than not, arguments arise because the two definitions are muddled and confused. If we were to travel through China 100 years ago, we would pass through places speaking 100 different languages or dialects. Linguists have since grouped them under one umbrella term, Sinitic languages, and placed them within the Sino-Tibetan language family. Within the Sinitic language group are all the Chinese languages, and there are 11 branches. Each branch is known as a dialect group. Here it's worth remembering that within each dialect group are not just dialects, there may also be distinct languages. The 11 dialect groups are Mandarin, Yue, Wu, Min, Jin, Hakka, Xiang, Gan, Huizhou, Pinghua, and Tunkan. As the purpose of this video is to explain Penang Hokkien in relation to all the Sinitic languages, we will zero in on its dialect group, and that's Min. The Min dialect group can be categorized into two branches, Inland Min and Coastal Min. Inland Min can be divided into two sub-branches, Northern Min, spoken in Nanping, and Central Min, spoken in Sanming. Coastal Min has three sub-branches, Eastern Min, Puxian Min, and Southern Min. Within Eastern Min, the dominant or prestige form is Fuzhou or Hokkien. Puxian Min is a language in itself and is spoken in the city of Putian. It shares 62% similarity with Quanzhou Hokkien and 39% with Fuzhou. And then there's Southern Min or Minnan, and that's where Hokkien enters the picture. The name Southern Min or Minnan is often used interchangeably to mean the Hokkien language. You will see it in some books and even the official dictionary of the Taiwan Ministry of Education. But that is not entirely correct. Southern Min is not entirely Hokkien. It also has two sub-branches. The first sub-branch is indeed Hokkien, whose dialects include the Hokkien spoken in Quanzhou, Zhangzhou, Xiamen, Taiwan, Singapore, Medan, and of course Penang. But that is only scratching the surface. In fact, Hokkien has numerous dialects. Aside from the aforementioned, there are also dialects or variants pertaining to Taipei, Kaohsiung, Taichung, Hsinchu, Lukang, Sanxia, Yilang, Kinmen, and Magong, to name some. And although the pronunciation in Penang is largely based on the Zhangzhou dialect, it is not always so, with the pronunciation of some words following that of Quanzhou and Xiamen. This is due partly because the word entered Penang Hokkien at a later stage and came from Quanzhou or Xiamen speakers rather than from Zhangzhou speakers. The second sub-branch of Minnan is called Chaoshan Min, and under this sub-branch there's Teochew and the Shantou dialect of Teochew. So, when is a Chinese tongue a dialect and when is it a language? When we speak of all these Sinitic languages in reference to Standard Chinese, then all of them are Chinese dialects. But when we speak of them as itself, they are languages. For example, the major languages spoken in Penang are Malay, Mandarin, English, and Penang Hokkien. Applied under such a context, Penang Hokkien is a language. However, when referring to Penang Hokkien in relation to other varieties of Hokkien, then it is known as a dialect. Under such context, Penang Hokkien is a dialect of the Hokkien language, which is within the Southern Min group, which is part of the Min dialect group of the Sinitic language branch of the Sino-Tibetan language family. The next thing we want to cover is how did Mandarin get its dominant position over all the various Sinitic languages. Many people, including those with Chinese education, harbor the idea that Mandarin is Chinese and has always been the language used by the Chinese people for centuries. But that's a fallacy. In fact, the Chinese people have been using Mandarin as the official language for less than 100 years. Standard Mandarin Chinese was only adopted in 1932 after the National Language Unification Commission made its decision after considering various Chinese languages and even an artificial pronunciation, now known as Old National Pronunciation, as the basis for a national language. But if Mandarin was only used since 1932, what have the Chinese people been using before Mandarin? And why was Mandarin introduced to replace whatever that came before it? To answer that question, let's go back in time. Before the introduction of Mandarin, the Chinese people practiced what linguists call diglossia, or what I would call a two-tier form of communication, the lower register and the upper register. The lower register is the spoken language, and there's a multitude of these. Some provinces have several regional dialects. All the Sinitic languages we spoke of earlier, be it Hokkien, Cantonese, Shanghainese or Hakka, are in the lower register. But why are there so many languages and dialects in the past? Why didn't the people speak one common language? Living in a world where we are surrounded by telecommunication devices, be it the telephone or the internet or even the TV or radio, is something that is difficult for us to comprehend. Telecommunication devices are so commonplace in present times, we have taken for granted and stopped appreciating what it has given to us. Through the use of the telephone, radio, television, movies and the internet, we can carry sound across great distances. We can record sounds and replay the sounds as often as we wish. This was not possible in the past. Imagine a world without the internet, without television, without radio, without the telephone, without even electricity. Then a lot of things we take for granted is not possible. In the past, to learn a different language or even words, a learner has to be present when the teacher spoke. There was no such thing as distant learning. And as there was no way to record what was spoken and replay it later, people learn orally and have to repeat what was spoken to them accurately afterwards. As merchants, bureaucrats and the military brought new words from one region of China to another, what the people learned is dependent on how well they heard the introduced words and how well they were able to pronounce what was said. Any distortion in pronunciation, even the inability to pronounce and reproduce a foreign word accurately, results in the localized pronunciation of that word. This gave rise to variance in pronunciation, and with that, dialects emerged. Most of them exist only in spoken form, even though there is a varying degree of development in writing them out. Cantonese, for example, has a well-developed writing system using traditional Chinese characters. But the same can't be said of many of the other Chinese languages, including Hokkien. In the case of the vernacular form of Hokkien, while many of the words were assigned their Chinese characters, the spoken language never developed a written form that is used by the literate Hokkien speakers. As a result, people who spoke Hokkien are largely illiterate in their spoken language. But if that were the case, does it mean that the Hokkiens were unable to communicate in writing at all? Surely the Hokkien seafaring merchants who visited Malacca in the 16th to 18th centuries must have learned some form of written communication. Yes, they did. But to understand how they communicated, we now go to the upper register. Existing alongside the lower register, which is the spoken languages of China, is the upper register or the written language. This written language is known as literary Chinese. It was derived from classical Chinese and has remained largely unchanged for 1,000 years. Literary Chinese was the method for the Chinese people to communicate in written form. It was more a written communication than a spoken language. It has its own sentence structure that is often different and not reflected in the myriad of spoken languages of China. And it does not have a universal pronunciation, but is instead pronounced differently by different groups of people. The Hokkiens who learned to read literary Chinese would read it in the Hokkien literary reading, while the Cantonese would do so in the Cantonese literary reading. Literary Chinese was a marvelous invention that enabled the peoples across the vast expanse of China to gain literacy and communicate among themselves. And until they developed their own writing system, the Koreans, Japanese, and Vietnamese also used literary Chinese as the way to communicate in writing. However, across China, before Mandarin was introduced, the majority of the people were illiterate. They speak a multitude of spoken languages which we lump together under the lower register. Only a fraction of the population had the opportunity to learn to read and write. These are the upper class, the elites, usually sons of well-to-do families who have the means to get private tutoring. Literacy was therefore confined to a small group of people comprising the bureaucrats of Mandarin, the merchants, and the priesthood. Those are the ones who need written communication to get by. The rest of the population can go on with life without ever learning to read or write. To this day, people who speak Hokkien are often unaware that there are two sets of pronunciation for many words. One set comes from the lower register, the spoken language used daily, and another set comes from the upper register, the written language used by those who learn to read and write. It is not uncommon for words in the upper register to creep into the lower register and enter the spoken mainstream. For example, the word for dragon in Hokkien is leong in the upper register and ling in the lower register. Most people who speak Hokkien would have encountered both leong and ling, but as they have never received formal education in Hokkien, they are unable to explain why there are two pronunciations, and often they explain the reason incorrectly. The pronunciation from the upper register usually appears in formal contexts such as in written communication, in name of temples and buildings, anywhere where the written form is required. This written form is actually literary Chinese, though read in the Hokkien literary reading. But since it is seldom strung into full sentences, it is often mistaken for Hokkien or Old Hokkien or written Hokkien. But is it possible to write spoken Hokkien using the same Chinese characters? Yes, but as mentioned, it was never developed to a stage where it became the mainstream form of communication, even among the Hokkiens who are literate. For them, the proper way to communicate in writing is to use literary Chinese. Literary Chinese existed alongside the multitude of spoken languages for some 1,000 years. It remained static, for there was no reason for it to evolve. On the other hand, in the absence of audio recording instruments, the spoken languages continue to branch out, giving birth to more and more dialects. If literary Chinese was such a marvelous invention, why was it phased out? Why are we using Mandarin today instead of literary Chinese? Although literary Chinese enabled different people to communicate among themselves, it did not allow them to speak to one another in one common language. That was not a problem until the turn of the 20th century. It was a new century and the dawn of telecommunication. With the discovery of electricity, advances were made in the field of communications and media. Devices that hitherto could not be imagined were being invented. They included the telephone, radio, and movies, all of which allowed the recording and transfer of audio sound. People were now able to talk to one another through great distances. But in China, where distant communication had all along been through the written text of literary Chinese, this could not be appreciated as people of great distances did not understand one another. After the demise of the Qing dynasty and the founding of the Republic of China in 1912, a movement gained momentum to create a common national language. What that means is that the ruling government had decided that literary Chinese had run its course and it was time to collapse the two-tier system of upper and lower register into one single tier where all Chinese peoples can speak, read, and write a common language. The advantage was obvious. If the people across China could communicate in one common language, it would be much easier to govern them, control them, and unite them. And this would be supported by the newly invented communication devices. But to achieve that required a bold and radical move. Literary Chinese, though it was the form of communication for so long, was shown the door simply because it did not have a uniform pronunciation. And it all happened largely without any opposition. And a search was on for a language to replace it. In the early 1930s, the National Language Commission decided that that language would be based on the language spoken in Beijing. That's the Beijing dialect, and here the word dialect is used to mean that it was one of the languages of the lower register in relation to literary Chinese. It was chosen for its prestigious status, being the spoken language used by officials in Beijing. What needed to be done was to give it a written form. This came into being in 1932 when the Commission published a dictionary of the Beijing dialect called the Vocabulary of National Pronunciation for Everyday Use. The name given for this language, derived from the Beijing dialect, was Guoyu. After the communist takeover of China, the government of the People's Republic of China continued the effort and in 1955 renamed the language Putonghua. However, the name Guoyu continued to be used by the republics of China in Taiwan. While both governments are in agreement to do away with literary Chinese and replace it with Mandarin, they differ in the implementation of the written form. The government of the Republic of China continued to use traditional Chinese characters inherited from literary Chinese, while the government of the People's Republic of China opted for simplified Chinese characters. The success of the Chinese government to introduce Mandarin, and in so doing introduce literacy across China, is something that is often understated and undervalued. It was an astonishing achievement that transformed Chinese society. Although the government of the People's Republic of China was largely credited for the introduction of simplified Chinese characters, the idea of using simplified characters to facilitate education goes back much earlier, to 1909, and discussions on character simplification was also carried out during the Kuomintang government in the 1930s and 40s. Many of the simplified characters are inspired by the cursive written text of Chinese or Chaosu, which dates as far back as the Qing dynasty. And in the name of national unity, there would be only one language with a written form across China, and that is Mandarin or Standard Chinese. Anything that stands in the way has to be stamped out. This includes literary Chinese, which has existed for 1,000 years. And in sacrificing literary Chinese, all the myriad spoken languages of China are also regarded as redundant and are standing in the way of national unity. So, in the decades following the introduction of Mandarin, steps were taken to suppress and even ruthlessly eliminate the use of all those spoken Chinese languages. Nowadays, Cantonese, Hokkien, and many of these non-Mandarin Chinese languages have been allowed to survive, but they do not receive official support and are relegated to the status of dialects. Today, the unity of the Chinese people in China through Mandarin has already been achieved, while the movement to preserve and develop remnants of the spoken language, Penang Hokkien being one, is being carried out outside the boundaries of China for its historic and heritage values. It could not be denied that the introduction of Mandarin has enabled the people across China to communicate in spoken form. Not even 100 years have passed, yet the Chinese have been able to unite themselves under one common language. And that is the history of the transformation of the Chinese language over the past 100 years. If you enjoyed this video, please take a moment to give it a like, as that will help the algorithm. Also, subscribe to this channel and click the notification button to be informed every time I upload a new video. Until we meet again, thanks for watching.